Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of the War Report, where we promise from the bottom of our hearts that on this program we will be completely above board with our language in discussing topics regarding West Africa. Because there's a lot of temptation, there's a lot of jokes that can be made, but we're better than that.
We are
We
better.
can rise above that, okay? In the immortal words of Michelle Obama, when they go low, we go. I cannot do this. I'm sorry. In all seriousness, welcome to yet another episode of the War Report, and we have quite a bit of news to cover. Yes, we will be covering the Niger situation. We have to be very careful to pronounce Niger properly, lest we, let's just say, ruffle some very important feathers. But we'll we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. So just we'll worry about that later. But we have plenty of news,
Yeah.
especially out of Ukraine. In which case, I will hand over the reins to you, my co-host GSP, to guide us through what has been happening in Ukraine about the past week and a half. Because although,
Yeah.
as you were telling me, the front lines have been a bit static, there's still quite a bit of news to cover.
There has been. But before I say anything on the war front, I just want to mention our good friend Gio. His YouTube channel is Giant Art Productions. You can also find him on Substack. And I did a, a discussion with him back in May of this year that he has uploaded um, Empire and its Discontents. Please go and listen. I think it turned out pretty well.
I
We
will have
cover a
to
lot of
co-sign that
topics.
with a caveat.
What's that?
If you enjoy the mysticism of GSP having, let's just say, moderate audio quality. If you do not want to hear GSP's voice in high audio quality, then do not listen to it because it does demystify it. It's worth it, but it does demystify it. I do have to warn all of you going
I,
into it.
I would agree. I would agree. I sound best lo-fi.
It's so true, so true.
Yes. So yeah, do have a look at that. Follow Geo. He's also on Twitter, Giant Art Productions, and I want to thank him again for the opportunity. I hope we do another one because the next one I will definitely bring some slides with me uh, because of the subject matter was well on many topics, but a lot of it was really about art and photography, and within like the modern context and also the civilizational context of the West. So yeah, if you can, please take a listen. So let's begin with the updates, and I'm going to start basically with the attacks that I think have been very significant, and then I'll move on to the the front lines because although fighting has been very bloody, um, not much territory has changed hands. This is turning into people have made the comparison before a type of World War I scenario where the victor wins by attrition. But to get to the strikes, so back about the 24th of July, there was an attack on Reni, which is a port in the Odessa Oblast, but it's on the border with Romania and Moldova. Now, I thought it was a couple of kilometers. It's like less than half a kilometer where the attack took place, and these were granaries that were destroyed. And then somewhere about, I think, yes, August 2nd, there was another attack, again, just a few yards from the border with Romania. And this attack was on Ismail, Ismail port. So the Russians are attacking extremely close to NATO borders. Uh, they're basically destroying the facilities to even have a grain deal. So I thought that was um, kind of important to think about. Um, and then the next bit of news in this area was that there were three ships, an Israeli, a Turkish, and a Greek ship, that had decided to break, you know, the blockade of the Russians, and they went into these ports in the Danube. And as soon as they were done, the Russians sent their missiles and destroyed whatever it is that they had dropped off. Now, it's probably the case that weaponry is going to Ukraine using the grain deal. Zelensky is extremely upset today. He made an announcement that he's going to strike within Russia. There's not going to be any boats left, and the reason for this, he can make that claim because there was an oil tanker that had come from Syria after dropping off oil, and it was attacked by the Ukrainians. It did not sink, so fortunately, there's no natural disaster. Although I don't know how much oil was still left on it, or what other cargo might have been on it. But this is, a commercial boat. It does not have guns or whatever. And the attack happened basically very close to where the Kerch Bridge is. So in the Krasnodar area. This area has been hit by the Ukrainians in the past 2 weeks quite a bit, including the town of Taganrog, which is only about 15, 16 kilometers from the border with Donetsk, and it's on the Sea of Azov. It's very close to Mariupol, in fact, right? Um, the Russians have retaliated, and there have been a lot of retaliatory strikes. They dropped a fab bomb on Velika Novsilka, which is the town in the Zaporozhye region where Zaporozhye meets Donetsk Oblast. Uh, this is according to Ukrainian monitoring channels. There were at least three powerful arrivals on the positions of Ukrainian armored forces in the village. Then there was an attack, and an interesting detail about the next attack is in Dnepropetrovsk. It looks like the Russians took out some kind of a high rise where the Ukrainians said that there was nobody in it. There were only 7 dead. But the Turks are citing Ukrainian sources, and they report that there was an urgent call for blood donations. People were being evacuated. Again, this would have been in late July. I know it's been over a week since we last did the show, and then more and more attacks in the last 48 hours. There are satellite images that reveal hotspots in Khmelnytsky region at Starokonstantinov. Starokonstantinov is an area that's been hit several times. It is an Air Force base. Again, the Dnepropetrovsk region in Kamiensk, that was also hit. The Rivne region in Western Ukraine, which, based on the videos, it looks like an ammunition depot. And in the Ivano-Frankovsk region at Yamnitsa, there were more rocket attacks there. So, then, as I said, lots of retaliation. The Ukrainians, for the first time, maybe they've done it before, but in a big way, used their cluster munitions on civilians, and they attacked Donetsk city in the center and set ablaze their University for Economics and Trade. The Russians then attacked themselves in the Kupiansk area, and the attack was such that the Ukrainians actually, like, their channels started putting up notices for. In fact, it was some kind of a blood transfusion hospital. So I'm guessing this is where a lot of frontline soldiers of Ukraine go to treat their wounds, to receive operations and such. So that was quite an attack. And then just today, there was an attack on the Krasnomayor, Krasnoarmeysk, or the Pokrovsk region of Donetsk. This is right on the border with Zaporozhye. It is due west of Donetsk city. It is even further. It's kind of like southwest of Kramatorsk. Okay, but it is nowhere near the Dnieper River. Um, the other thing that has happened, of course, is in the last week or two, is that the Ukrainians mounted a successful attack on uh, a, a railroad bridge in uh, Chongar, and then they attacked again in this region in Chongar, I believe a day or two ago, and caused a hole in one of the bridges. Now, these bridges are they're small. They're kind of like bridges that go over a shallow estuary. They're not like the Antonovsky Bridge. Okay. Um, so, they're not, how can I put it? They're not very significant. Uh, they are there to disturb the supply, the logistics of the Russians for Zaporozhye, and that's their main purpose in doing this. Terror is part of it. The other thing, of course, that has been happening for the last 2 weeks is several drone attacks on Moscow. There was one this weekend that was successfully stopped. Uh, there were two others that were partly successful. Um, both times, three drones made it into the Moscow space. Both of them that were two of the three were knocked down, but each attack, just before the weekend, had at least one drone attack a business um, department of the Russian government. It's in a it's in the new Moscow sector where they have all these modern buildings. Moscow has like very strict um, building codes. No buildings can, very much like Paris. So all the new stuff has to go into a designated area far away from the center of the city. Now, each each time it was the same building that was hit, and each time the Russians managed to steer it through electronic warfare, and it crashed in the wee hours of the morning. I think sometime between midnight and two or 3 o'clock in both instances. No one was hurt. Um, Now we can kind of get into the frontline news, and I sent you, Constantine, the first photo. Kind of gives you an idea, and this will kind of dovetail nicely into the change in the narrative in the West concerning Ukraine that has been developing, particularly in the last week. So the first photo gives you an idea of the southern front, the Zaporozhye front, with a bit of the Donetsk front in that pumpkin color
I
to the
do
right
have
of
to
it.
admit, when I first saw this map, just at a glance, I thought it was Yemen.
Yeah, yes, I know because of the shape.
Because of the shape, because of the colors, the territory that's been taken, and I'd actually read something along the lines of where it was describing the counteroffensive. It was just something, I think it was on Twitter or Telegram. I was just breezing through it and just reading about the casualty numbers. Once again, I just assumed the Saudis resumed operations in Yemen for some reason, but
Yeah.
it the resemblance is striking, and
Hmm.
you can give some more detail on that because I'm sure everyone is very interested to
Yeah.
hear that.
So the dark purple blots that you see at the top of the reddish color, that is how much territory Ukraine has gained since June the 4th. And I can say now for August the 7th that there have been no no changes. The only one being is that the town of Staromayorsk, um, the Ukrainians controlled the number the third like a third of it in the north, and now they've extended and taken all of it. They committed to attacking the next village next to it, Uruzhanye. They have not taken Uruzhanye, but that is the only kind of significant development. Is they've managed to take the whole village of Staromayorsk and or Staromayorskoye in Russian. So if you want, I'm going to. That is the one, two, three, four, five, six, seventh. The seventh slide that
Ah,
will
lucky
give
number
you an
7.
idea.
Let me just get that right there. Yep. And whenever you're ready, I have it up.
Yeah. So this is if we go to back to the first slide that I gave you, that's the big purple blob area. That's where that is, right? Now, none of these advances have reached the first formal line of defense that the Russians built throughout the winter and early spring. Um, the other significant thing that has happened since the last show is, we were talking about Klishevka falling, and there was a point where a third of Klishevka was controlled by the Ukrainians, but now the Russians have managed to take full control of Klishevka. The Ukrainians are attacking from the north. They still control the heights, the fortified heights north of Klishevka. Minor gains there, but it still stands intact. And that road to the east of it that goes into Bakhmut has not been breached yet. So the Russians are very committed, from what I understand. They sent there were two different troops that were in this area. One of them was I believe, the Lugansk People's Republic's militias, who are not part of the Russian military, but that's who they are. And the other was a Russian unit that had been fighting in this area for a long time. And casualties have been very high on both sides. And even the Akhmat Sila guys, the Chechens, were brought in to stabilize the situation. And as far as I understand, rotations have finally occurred because the men there were attrition and taking very heavy losses. So the other slide is that I'm going to show you. Well, actually, here's kind of a slide I'm going to. The last slide gives you an idea of the Bakhmut front, right? Where the fighting is taking place. If you want to upload that one.
Got it.
Yeah, so that's Klishevka. Like I say, a few days ago, the Russians. I heard even rumors that they had lost Klishevka completely. So I was very surprised yesterday that they had regained it. And in the Svatovo, Kremenaya, Kupiansk direction, that part way up north around Kharkov and Lugansk. This is the fourth from the bottom. You can see what gains the Russians have made today. Apparently, it's like 16 square kilometers, but as you can see, they are still a ways from Kupiansk, which is, if you see the Syriac map with the at symbol, that is where Kupiansk is.
Bottom left corner.
Yes, bottom left corner. So yeah, so those are basically the changes. But I think what's maybe more important is the headlines that have been coming out. And maybe one of the interesting headlines I brought up on the last show was by the Wall Street Journal. Ukraine's lack of weaponry and training risks stalemate and fight with Russia. And then it goes on to say Western military officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons, from shells to warplanes, that it needed to dislodge Russian forces. But they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the day. Now, this is crazy, right? Uh, the German publication Bild, about a week later, criticized, and this article is from, I believe, the 22nd or 23rd of July. But Bild, a week later, came back and said, Ukraine doesn't know how to use this equipment. Okay, this is preposterous, right? These guys are trained in, yes, maneuver warfare. They're also trained in combined arms warfare. Well, guess what? They don't have combined arms. They don't have an air force. They barely have an air defense system, right? So this stuff it just doesn't make sense to me. And then Political came up with an article that said Allies' main effort for Ukraine is shifting from donating weapons to fixing them. Insane, right? Washington Post, U.S. in no hurry to provide Ukraine with long-range missiles. Now, it should be said, the attacks on those bridges on that connect Crimea with Kherson, the French Scalp long-range cruise missile was used. Now, the photo is like, it's underwhelming because it's made like a hole in the ground, but it's not like, these things cost $1 million each, so it's not like, how can I put it? It's not a really effective way um, to to deal with it. I'll just send it to you now, Constantine. This will give you a
Okay,
good
I'll
idea.
get it. Uh, yeah, I'll get that one.
Hmm.
Okay, and there we are.
Yeah. So you can see, I mean, it's being repaired now, but it's not like, how can I put it? Like, the Russians have ferry boats and all this stuff, right? To move their supplies. Um, it's not the only bridge. They have to go a longer route to get stuff, but it's not like the end of the world for them. The other thing to keep in mind, but I would say the bigger threat in the Black Sea for the Russians right now, because it did take out the Olenin Gorsky Gornyak, which is a large landing ship. These are, I guess, like some of those amphibious military ships, and that was taken out by a kamikaze drone boat, right? Again, it didn't sink. There's video footage of this being brought for repairs. But the interesting thing is, just like the SIG oil tanker, it happened relatively in the same area. So, as far as I understand, I could have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure one of those two, if not both, but definitely one of those two ships was attacked in the Krasnodar area, not that far from the Kerch Bridge or like the town of Anapa. Um, even towns like Galenchik, which are further south, maybe even Sochi, I don't know. Um, we'll have to wait and see if the Ukrainians are able to uh, hit targets further afield, or whether they'll or whether the Russians will adapt. But to get back to this is another one from let me see who again, German outlet Bild has revealed an internal Bundeswehr document which contains damning assessment of how the Ukrainian forces of Ukraine used the equipment and skills acquired in the West in the counteroffensive. Again, so they're criticizing that. There's a blame game that's beginning to develop, but at the same time, they have articles that say, well, we kind of had our fingers crossed, right? All these men are getting 1 or 2 months of training instead of 3 or 4, just to keep something in mind. So I think it's interesting just how much the blaming has begun, how unself-aware it is. Then we have another article this time by the New York Times, quoting one of the soldiers: "There are 8 out of 160 left in my company." AFU soldiers are horrified by the attacks of the O group and the ZVO. That's, I guess, their combined forces, right? Ukrainian soldiers are frightened by the shelling and go crazy. The New York Times talked about a nightmare arranged for the Ukrainian forces of Ukraine, for the armed forces of Ukraine in the Limansk and Kupiansk directions, where Ukrainians are forced to defend themselves. This is the other thing. The Russians are making gains in the northern part of the theater, and the reason they're doing that is to, I believe, reduce the amount of pressure that is being applied to Bakhmut, Artemyevsk, and Zaporozhye. That's its main purpose: is to draw Ukrainian forces away from these areas, because we're not seeing huge amounts of like heavy armor moving across the Zhirobets River. Now, the Ukrainians did manage to take some of almost half of the progress that the Russians had made in some areas around the Svatovo area, not in the Kupiansk area, but they still haven't managed to push the Russians on the other side of the Zhirobets River. And there was another village whose name escapes me right now that was taken by the Russians just about 2 days ago or yesterday. Uh, Another headline from the Wall Street Journal: half of AFU sappers are blown up by mines. There are between 50 and 70 people in the hospital on the southern front every day. They are given the first necessary aid and sent to the rear. Surgeon Volkov from the 23rd Brigade says that 4 soldiers with their legs were cut off brought to him the other day. Crazy, crazy headlines. Another headline: 18 members of the IDAR battalion are now in Russia. They are they're in court. Um, Another one, I believe this is from USA Today. NATO is experiencing donor fatigue and disappointment with Zelensky's bluster, McFate told USA Today. He's losing credibility, Ukraine's main asset. Providing Ukraine with more weapons and expecting the nation to win the war is definition of strategic insanity. The war won't be won on the battlefield because no wars are won that way anymore. Goes and then from the New York Times: tens of thousands of losses. When's the last time you heard the West being that honest about the losses on the Ukrainian side? Right?
I
It was
mean, this
something.
is probably the first time in over the course of the war since the outbreak of the war in 2022 at February, not counting the action in the
Mhm.
Donbass before the war, that this is probably the most honest they have ever been since the start of this war.
Yes,
And also a story I
yes.
wanted to throw in the mix with the public opinion souring on Ukraine is I might be jumping the gun a little because I know we had some stuff to talk about with Wagner and their activity in Belarus on the border, but there was statements from Mikhailo, and he said Ukraine will consider Poland a close friend until the end of hostilities, and after that the competition will begin in countries in which Kiev will strictly defend its interests. And this was apparently there have been a lot of behind the scenes tensions between the Poles and the Ukrainians
Hmm.
with the way a lot of the Ukrainian refugees and diaspora have been behaving in Poland, with Poland's demands of Ukraine in terms of assistance and wanting to have, for example, with some things I'm sure you've seen that we've talked about with administrative control of Lviv and having more Lvov or having more presence there, etc., etc. And I can't attest how true this is, but allegedly Zelensky was not very happy with some of the recent Polish statements on the conflict. So, what was, and I would argue, what is probably the most steadfast supporter of this war, you're already seeing
Hmm.
things start to blow up behind closed doors there. And and strangely enough, that is as the reality of war becomes far closer to Poland with the activity happening right now in Belarus. It's far less abstract than it was in February of 2022. But I'll allow you to continue because I'm sure you have more headlines to
Yeah,
cover in that regard.
I do. So this one is from, but I'm glad you brought that up because that is an important factor that's going to only develop further, right, as time goes on. Who was it? I don't know if it was Danilov. No, Podolyak said that Poland is her closest friend, but after the war, we will go back into a competitive mode. Interesting statement, right? So this one is from CNN. Massacre in Staromayorsky on the Vremenevsky Ledge. The 247th Airborne Regiment hid in the basements and made a bloodbath of the armed forces of Ukraine. Like, just listen to this. Ukraine faced many problems when trying to storm Staromayorsk. A leading American TV channel reports the advance of the Ukrainian troops were overshadowed by debilitating losses. Before the assault, Ukrainians estimated that the city was defended by only 20 Russian fighters. City is really stretching it. This is literally, it is a village. But another 200 soldiers were hidden in different basements and did not even go to the toilet, apparently using plastic bottles underground to hide from reconnaissance drones. As a result, the command of the armed forces of Ukraine considered that 70 fighters were quite sufficient number for the assault. This led to heavy losses in the ranks of the Ukrainian troops. Quote, when you storm under enemy fire, you have nowhere to hide, complained CNN FSU with the call sign. U.S. faces hurdles in ramping up munitions. Now, it is true South Korea and Bulgaria have signed contracts to create more shells for the Ukrainians. But according to the Financial Times, Ukraine used more than 10 years worth of American munition supplies in a year and a half. Its counteroffensive alone uses 8,000 munitions per day. No wonder the Ukraine Western backers advise its troops to minimize its reliance on artillery and either engage more aggressive maneuvers or even darker to rely on human resources. This is not the only article I saw that said this. They literally advised them. They don't use the term human wave, but they say, you have to uh, preserve more of your armor. So maybe use more people,
Yeah, and once again,
to
I think people need to remember I mean, not just this audience, but just everyone in general needs to remember the absolute scale of this war and the disparity in both manpower and resources. I think at this
Mhm.
point, what is it? The Russians, in terms of artillery, outgun the Ukrainians about 5-1 at least. I think that's what it
Yeah,
was.
5 or 4 to 1, and then just the amount of munitions that they can fire is 10 to 1.
Yes,
But
and then
I would say the Ukrainians also what they do to parity in their most important fronts, what they'll do is they'll bring as many of these systems, right? Because there was a successful counter battery attack on Russian artillery. And what's interesting is that guy Ivan Popov, who was the commander of the Zaporozhye. He got transferred to Syria, but that is what he was complaining about before he got transferred. So they still have uh, very decent counter battery strength, but they're limited by its number.
yes, and once again, as time elapses, assuming a third world war doesn't break out, it really is just the Russians being able to outlast however
Yeah.
long the Ukrainians can continue returning fire. And I'm also once again left questioning because we can also talk about armor. I mean, just looking at Russia, largest stockpiles of tanks in the world. Now, these aren't all state of the art T90, T14, whatever, but point being is when you are in a state of total war, and I think this war has shown it on both sides, that you're going to use the less advanced and more reliable equipment, frankly. There's a reason why a lot of the equipment that was sent to Ukraine, a lot of the equipment that Russia has deployed, is not exactly these high tech 21st century weapons. Now, with the exception of drones, even though drones have been completely repurposed as to what they were used for before the course of this war, because they were once again those very high tech precise weapons. Now these things are pretty much just remote control cruise missiles. That's really no other way to
Mm-hmm.
put it. That's
Mm-hmm.
all they've been boiled down to. But getting at the ultimate point of all of this, there is, even with the Western supply and with how long it takes, it's going to be negated. There is no avenue of conventional military victory for the Ukrainians. There just isn't. Now, like I said, if they can convince the entirety of NATO to fight on Ukrainian battlefields, yeah, they could probably have a fighting chance then. I'm not going to get into particulars of what a NATO Rush war would look like. There's too many factors to consider. But point being is, although the Ukrainians have managed to slow down the Russians, have managed to deal quite a bit of damage on the Russians. Now, it's not as much as many people would like you to believe, but they have overperformed expectations, I would say, on most people's parts who aren't just completely enamored in Western media, engulfed in Western media. But at the end of the day, there is no long lasting counteroffensive. They will not be able to hold any of the territory that they retake. There is no avenue for victory short of internal political collapse inside of Russia. Now, I know that the entire Ukrainian establishment and, of course, all their backers are trying to spur on that internal collapse within Russia because that is the only means to victory. But it does make you wonder from the beginning of this war, with the amount of land that Ukraine has, it's the largest country in Europe, excluding Russia, with the amount of aid and resources been, why have they not been fighting a much more defensive war? Now, I think I know. It's a bit rhetorical on my part because I think I know the answer, of course. The sponsors of Ukraine, the people who have been funneling money and resources into this war effort, couldn't care less about the Ukrainians. They are as equally detestable to them as the Russians, but they're useful because they're fighting against the Russians. So they don't care about high Ukrainian casualties. As far as they can tell, there's no difference between these people. This is just an internal civil war that they are spurring on. So, yeah, if the Ukrainians want to charge themselves in the meat grinder, they're going to provide everything about that. It's not exactly like they're
Hmm.
looking to build up Ukraine as a strong and stable state. No, they're using it as a cash cow, as manpower. I mean, just look at all the money the politicians laundered to it, even throughout the course of this war. But it does make you wonder from any serious minds in Kiev, and perhaps this is just my ignorance of military strategy, because admittedly, I'm not a military officer. I don't have that kind of experience. I'll just put that out there. I think all of you know that already. But since day one, this has been far more of an offensive war for Ukraine than I think it really ever should have been. It should have just been them, look, willing to concede a certain amount of territory and then digging in their heels and retreating as they need to. It seems like a counteroffensive is completely counterintuitive to what they actually want to accomplish in this war, at least what Kiev says they want to accomplish.
Hmm. Yeah. There's something else that I think subconsciously, maybe it's occurring to some of the soldiers, but maybe it's a conscious thing with Ukrainian command, and that is the carrot and stick nature of this agreement. Like, I guess what I'm getting at is maybe they're thinking NATO in some portion will eventually enter Ukraine. And however many Ukrainians have to die to attrition Russia to give NATO a chance is what should happen. That's really, like, I mean, they have literally said that they're going to attrition Russia. Now, they can't win that war unless someone else comes in, right? So, in a sense, I don't know if subconsciously people are just saying this, or yeah, that is the plan, right? There'll be a certain point where Russia just cannot kill as many Ukrainians, or there'll be attrition enough that it's the perfect time for NATO to go in. I don't know, but that seems to be the implication. But just to round out the headlines, because there's two doozies, not this one that I'm about to read, but there are two or three doozies. So CNBC, August 2nd, Ukraine has tested its allies' patience with its military strategy and demands Frustrations have also come to a head with Ukraine's ongoing needs and demands, and so forth and so on. New York Times: Ukrainian troops trained by the West stumble in battle. Um, and then this one is a doozy. Ukraine's plan if Russia assassinates Zelensky, from Politico. That is insane, right? Like, that came out, I believe, Thursday or Wednesday of last week. According to Politico, a plan is ready in Kiev in case of the death of Volodymyr Zelensky. As per the Ukrainian constitution, the duties of isn't it so nice that they're ready for this? The duties of the president in his absence should be assumed by the chairman of the Verkhovna Rada. However, Ruslan Stefanchuk is not popular among Ukrainians, notes the publications. The publication. Journalists speculate that in the event of Zelensky's death, power in Ukraine would be divided among influential individuals, including Stefanchuk, the president's office chief, Andrei Yermak, foreign minister Dmytro Kuleba, and the defense minister Alexei Reznikov. Moreover, the publication believes that Zelensky's death would have a strong impact on the West, which might increase pressure on Kiev to initiate negotiations with Russia. Now, why would Russia want to kill Zelensky? Right? You remember in the winter? And the first few days of spring, how many articles there were about the U.S. telling Zelensky to give up on defending Bakhmut? Right? You remember that?
Oh
That it was
yes.
not worth holding on to it. But he refused. Even Zelensky, his military chief, not Syrski, the guy who's just in charge of the ground forces, although that's no small position. In Ukraine, that's essentially the second highest position because they don't have a navy or an air force. But you remember all those headlines? Zelensky telling him we should leave Bakhmut, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
the Russians they had more planes, they had more air defense systems back in January, February, and March, although they were running out because the Taharia Discord leaks, said that by the first half of May, Ukraine would be in big trouble with a lack of air defense missiles, even if they had lots of systems. So, if they had at that time is what I'm because they lost 40,000 guys for that town, and they still lost a town, and they mounted a counteroffensive to take Bakhmut. I literally saw a headline that said, "Fighting to retake Bakhmut is harder than expected." Like, essentially what they've done is they've taken territory from this, as we've already said about Klishevka, but that whole region of Chasov Yar, they retook that, but there's no town there. Those are fields. Granted, they're making the right move, but they've been trying since June, right? So they're wasting all these valuable resources, right? Because the whole thing was, look, you attack Zaporozhye, you make it down to the Sea of Azov. That's supposed to scare everybody. Meanwhile, you're doing drone attacks on the Black Sea, drone attacks on Moscow. You're sending missiles into Taganrog and Rostov on Don, and you're terrifying, and then the Russian public will snap, right? That was the plan. I mean, even if you don't believe that plan was going to work, right? You would have gained more territory in Zaporozhye if you had just left Bakhmut alone, right? So why would the Russians want to get rid of this guy? This guy's an idiot, right? Again, unless they believe that we're just going to sacrifice as many Ukrainians to attrition Russia to the point that our partners will feel confident that they can enter Ukraine and win. That's the only thing I can think of, right?
That
So
is
what would happen
a.
if Zelensky was killed? Well, it wouldn't be the Russians who would kill him.
Oh, exactly.
And then, yes, and then the other bit of news is the IAEA has now formally given their conclusions for the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and said there were never any mines anywhere. And then uh, NBC News had a doozy of a headline last week. Is Ukraine's counteroffensive failing? Kiev and its supporters worry about losing control of the narrative. The narrative? Control of the narrative? I mean, even the Telegraph had a headline from the 18th in July. Ukraine and the West are facing a devastating defeat. The prospect of a failed counteroffensive and significant territorial concessions would only embolden Russia and China. Well, yeah. Um, so, anyways, that is enough of Ukraine. Um, I mean, I could go on for another hour to tell you all the other strikes that are happening. You know, the civilians getting killed in Donetsk, Belgorod, whatever. But you know, we don't. The show can't deal with all of that. And I don't know which
Ladies and
topic you
gentlemen, I
want
regret to inform you that we are not that autistic. um,
to.
I, I do want to move on to some of the Wagner stuff in Belarus before getting into some of the West
Yes.
African news, but I just did want to expand a little on what you were saying with Zelensky, with Bakhmut, with Ukraine being used is more or less a blood sacrifice, if we're being honest, in order to
Yeah.
provoke a larger war and, at least what they hope, the collapse of Russia. So I think you make an interesting point that yes, if Zelensky is going down, it's going to be from the inside. And I look, I didn't have as an extensive list as you, but I have been seeing the headlines that are souring on Ukraine, that are souring on
Yeah.
Zelensky, and especially with the conditions, and a lot of it, admittedly, I will say, is anecdotal. A lot of the footage I see from the streets in Ukraine and the treatment there. I do want to actually backtrack a bit because I did watch a video over this weekend that was it was a Russian journalist, even though he spoke remarkable English. I don't know whether he was just a journalist based in Russia or, again, I don't know his exact situation, but not tied to any major media outlets, so that does make it a bit more credible, in my opinion. He was doing interviews, at least for the first half of this mini documentary, of the Ukrainian nationals who fled to Russia since the start of the war. And a lot of
Oh
them
yeah.
from places like Kherson, from places like Kharkov, evacuated with the Russian forces, and a lot of it was just the anonymous garbled speech subtitle thing that you get because these people said we still have family in Ukraine, we don't want them to face reprisals for what we did, explaining their situations that realistically just as simple as being a local bureaucrat or a school teacher was enough to get you branded as a collaborator. And
Yeah.
it just things that we've gone over time and time again. Uh, it reminds me also of the other videos I saw from internally displaced Ukrainians from places like Mariupol, from places like Bakhmut, who were once again in these frontline towns who fled west, which presumably means that they have no great sympathy towards the Russians in that case, who go to places like Odessa, Kiev, Lvov, and are hassled on the street for either speaking Russian or not speaking Ukrainian properly. And I'm not saying all of this to morally grandstand, even though once again I do think it is wrong. Don't make no mistake here. But Ukraine at this point, especially with the outbreak of this war, is such a fractured nation, which we were all told at the beginning of this, despite the internal differences in Ukraine, they're all going to band together and unite in the face of a common threat. I mean, if anything, this war has drawn very clear lines. You are either pro-Russia or you're against Russia. Now, a lot of pro-Russian elements have been suppressed by the government simply because of wartime, as these things do happen. But as we've seen with 2.8 million Ukrainians heading towards Russia since the outbreak of this war, that's not counting the millions who have left from Ukraine to Russia since 2014, since the Maidan. But with the military blunders, with the political crises, with Zelensky who's probably either going to be overthrown or assassinated, in the near future, I'm not going to put a time frame on that, but I don't think he is long, at least for his position as president. And I guess my most schizo theory is if they can secure a ceasefire, they can, it's quote unquote peaceful enough to hold elections. So they're going to get rid of him one way or another. Is what I'm getting at here. And now, what the power arrangement will look like after that, I don't know. But between the military crises, the political crises, even the religious crises, I mean, it was one. I can't remember which one it was. I wish I did because he deserves to have his name said. But one of the bishops from the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church was sentenced to 5 years today. And
Pavel,
yes, thank you.
Metropolitan Pavel of Kiev.
Yes, he
Can
was.
I just add just
Yeah, go
one little
ahead.
thing to what you're saying? Today, I saw a video from a Uniate priest, Catholic. What do they call them? Greek
Ukrainian.
Greek
Yeah,
Catholic.
Ukrainian Catholic, Byzantine, whatever.
So he's been reported. Why? Because he gave a sermon yesterday about the beautiful people of Ukraine and Russia. They're brotherly, that they must work together for the kingdom of heaven, for the kingdom of God, and to spread God's word, and that they have to put in it. And holy moly, there was this woman, this very attractive woman, um, who very modestly dressed, and two guys, but she did most of the talking. Honestly, she just droned on and on. Whether the priest was talking to her or the other two guys, the priest would form the sign of the cross on them. These people uh, eventually reported him for saying that. So this is the first time I'm hearing a Uniate priest say something like this. In fact, another Uniate priest in the region, this is in Western Ukraine, okay, I forget, I mean, it's around Lvov or Ivano-Frankovsk. Okay, it's in that area, and um, another, a bishop of the area said that he should be punished. Just crazy, crazy stuff.
I mean,
And there was, yes, go ahead.
I know you had brought up that just about the Uniate, the Eastern Catholic priest right there, and I mean it's what you would expect to hear from I think any priest during a war that like this needs to stop by one means or another, and it's completely
But
nothing.
I haven't heard any
Yeah,
Uniate priest say something like this.
yeah, it's remarkable to hear, but I mean I don't think that indicates a larger trend. Don't get me wrong, but I do think what we are looking at now, I know there are a lot of, especially for the Ukrainian government, a lot of careful maneuvers they would have to make. But I mean, they're trying to make this State Department church the main one. I would say even over the unions, and I mean historically the unions have been that foot in the door for a lot of Western influence in places like Ukraine. But yeah, that the fact that any even something as let's just say as a simple statement like that, not to downplay the meaning of the statement, but once again, it's not anything that I haven't heard before, and like I said, I think it's a rather reasonable statement. The fact that you're going to get reported and shaken down for that, it's this is a. I mean, look,
I mean,
wartime.
this is one of their own.
Yes, it is one
Mhm.
of their own. Wartime censorship, whatever. I know it happens. I'm not saying good, bad.
He's
It's
going to be
just
called a traitor. The other
yeah,
guys were traitors even when their mouths are closed.
uh,
This guy is now going to be a traitor.
exactly. But I'm just saying when you need to go to that extent, and I would say
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to you start targeting the clergy and religious institutions, you are a nation that is so fragile. You are a nation that is falling apart. There's no other way about
Hmm.
it. Ukraine,
Yeah.
once again, economically is completely insolvent. What economy does this country have beyond just being a massive grain exporter? In which case, the European Union has to sanction their grain half the time because it's either contaminated or pushing down on the market of other European Union states. This country is the AFU is this country, and that's not saying much. And
Yes.
the question is, I know the West can throw, at least at this point, seemingly endless amounts of money, especially with the American stranglehold on the global financial system. That look, admittedly, is slipping, but still very strong position in when it comes to global
Hmm.
finance. The question is, how much money does it take to keep something like this online? I think we don't know that, and the question of auditing gets shouted down before it even comes to that. But the question is, will there come to a point where not even blank checks of billions upon billions of dollars are enough to keep this country united? And I'm not saying this rhetorically. I'm genuinely asking your opinion, the audience's opinion. I want to know, beyond the surface level things, what is keeping this country united? Because it is against all logic. I, I, I cannot logically comprehend how the Ukrainian state has not collapsed yet, and I cannot imagine the efforts that have been taken by the American government, by the State Department, by Ukraine's other backers, in order to have prevented a total collapse of the state in Ukraine.
Right. I mean, it's also, of course, it's America that's keeping Ukraine afloat, um, which is kind of funny because, when we were talking about the war back in January 2022, I said the best thing that could happen is if Russia could make Ukraine a economic black hole for the EU and for America. Well, there was an article today about how unprepared the EU is to accept Ukraine and how much money it's already cost them. Again, not articles that we are accustomed to seeing. Um, that's another change in the narrative. But the real reason all of this happened in the first place, I think, is America basically said that if we don't try to subjugate Russia now, we will not get another chance in 20 years. And that's it.
Yeah, it really does follow a simple
This is
timeline.
their last chance.
They failed to subjugate in the 1990s when Russia's probably at the weakest it had been in centuries at that point. They didn't view reconciliation and at least a semi-equal partnership as ever a viable option for what I mean. We all know the reasons, but against all logic, when look, admittedly, there was a very narrow window where the West could have accepted that we need to trade reach for longevity, in which case that window of opportunity has passed, and they have that. Putin was very pro-Western from pretty much up until the Georgia War, and even after the Georgia War, he was still moderately
Mm-hmm.
pro-West. It was after the Maidan, I think all bets were off, and especially with the outbreak of this war. But there was a window of opportunity where the West could have traded some influence for probably several decades of longevity that isn't the, let's just say, hellish creature of the American empire that we see right now. Not that it would have been great by any means, but it would have been a major improvement over what we have now, is what I'm getting at. And now,
Yeah.
with the rise of China and Russia and China on friendly terms, I know you can talk about how they're secretly plotting against each other. Whatever. Point being is, regardless of whatever conflicts exist between Russia and China, whatever feuds may exist between them, there are far more pressing concerns from both them than to be eating each other. I do think, honestly, they have both learned their lesson from the Cold War that they can't
Mm-hmm.
turn in on each other, and they are both far more pragmatic and ideological states than the Soviet Union and China in the 1950s and 60s. Things have moved far away from ideology, whereas I know ideology wasn't the source of the Sino-Soviet conflict in its entirety, but a lot of it was differences over how communism or whatever particular term they wanted to put should be implemented. Now, those things have been smoothed over. Hell, Russia isn't even a communist country now. Ask some boomers, might be for a different answer, but I think you all get the point I'm getting at here.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're looking at is there's no reasonable avenue in which you can splinter Russia and China. That window of opportunity collapsed. So now it's really throw everything into Ukraine, hope it succeeds, because otherwise you're going to have to fight a world war if you want to divorce this emergent bloc of, I would say, Russia and China for certain, but India, all these smaller countries, and with recent events in Africa, which we'll get into, the African continent. Now, look, I've made this point several times, you can write off these countries, you can say they're third world hellholes, whatever. Well, point being is, these are resource rich third world hellholes with strategic geography. Sure, the populations, there might not be as smart as Westerners, whatever. I'll give you that much. It's true. And I don't want millions upon millions of them to show up on the shores of my country or any other European or Western country for that matter. But point being is, when you're turning them over to Russia and China, what they're doing is the most successful colonial enterprise since the collapse of the British and French and just the European empires in general. They are outdoing them at their own game. I know the French had their own half-baked attempt at trying to rebuild some semblance of their empire, but you look at the way the Russians conduct themselves in Africa, the Chinese conduct themselves in Africa. I don't care if you love Russia and China, hate Russia and China, whatever. Point being is, they have very successful and profitable endeavors in these places in Africa and the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. And once again, all of that has been ceded by the West to them because they can actually competently manage their foreign policies. They're very pragmatic. They actually have a sense of self interest that isn't this insane ideological crusade. Not that I'm saying that everyone in the West is an insane ideologue. I'm sure there's plenty of cynic opportunists, but I'm just having to say, with the complete lack of pragmatism in the foreign policy and frankly domestic policy in the American empire, just as an aside, I think these cynics, like I said, have been somewhat isolated from power because although I do think that they may have their biases, they may agree with at least some of this, they still are going to look out for their bottom line. But I think we're at a point now where there are a lot of people who are willing to completely destroy everything in order to just prove a point. But I'm getting sidetracked here with all of
Yeah,
this.
I mean, speaking of bottom line, right? Like that article I was referring to was from the Financial Times, and the Financial Times, just like the Economist, they're kind of the backbone of the regime. Okay, they're the part of the regime that doesn't go through cycles, or they're on much larger cycles of change than, let's say, the president's office, right? So they had an article called The Fast Consequences of Ukraine Joining the EU. The Financial Times published a substantial article today about the potential disastrous consequences for the European Union if Ukraine, an impoverished and ruined nation, were to join. The authors refer to the admission of Poland and Hungary as a frightening experiment, quote unquote, and they believe that accepting Ukraine would be an unbearable burden. According to the newspaper, quote, Ukraine has not yet joined the EU, but it has already had a negative impact on the common market. The thought of what would happen if it were to join is indeed frightening. The Financial Times points out that almost 62% of the EU's 7-year budget is currently spent on compensations to the agribusinesses sector and local budgets, with Ukraine's enormous farmland potential being part of the EU. The budget would likely be completely devastated. Overall, the newspaper strongly advises against taking such a risk. That's a pretty big deal, right? We've pointed out before that the Financial Times already had interviews both times, but particularly the first time that the Russian Freedom League commandos crossed over into Russia near the Belgorod region, or Kursk, no, Bryansk region, I think, and
Yeah,
they
that one's
killed the
Bryansk.
pensioner. Yeah, in Bryansk. Right away, like second day, these guys, like literally the day after, these guys had an interview with the guys who participated in it. That's so. I know most of our listeners already know this, but that tells you that these guys are very close to the regime. Okay, so if they're saying this,
I just want to point out that yeah, of course we do repeat things on the show a lot, but one of my goals of the show is where you can repeat these things in your sleep. If you ever have to talk about these subjects, if you're ever pressed on these subjects, I want you to. And look, I'm not at that point myself, but once again, repetition is key. These things need to be hammered in time and time again. These are things that are worth repeating, and I will do that as long as I have this program. I will re I will cover stories that are the same topic because these things do happen over and over again, and I think you have to realize the frequency at
mhm.
which these things actually do happen.
Yes, yes. So it is quite something. I don't know if you want to cover it. It is kind of important. Do you know about there was an explosion in Turkey?
Oh yes, I did see that.
Yeah.
yeah, I sent some stuff about that to you earlier, and
Yeah.
this is the second one after that. I can't remember the order, whether this one was the graphite factory or the ammunition factory, but I know that one of them exploded just about a week and a half ago in Turkey. And this is, of course, on top of everything else that's going on in Turkey with their seeming flip back to the West into being more conciliatory towards the West with the implosion of the grain deal and, of course, their previous dealings with Russia since even before the beginning of this war and their seeming pivot towards Russia, where it was once again another facility in Turkey exploded today. And
Hmm.
that was that was at the port of Durrance, which is east of Istanbul. And so far, it's only been reported 4 injuries. That's the most recent report that I have. You can update me if you've seen anything more recent, but that was from a few hours ago.
Yeah.
Um,
As I understand, 13 of the 16 um, grain elevators were destroyed. It's pretty
wow,
substantial.
that is yeah. I did not see that part. That's that is news to me. That I because I saw this when it first happened.
I
What was
mean,
that? Like that 10 hours ago, as of time of recording.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, these boats were loaded with weaponry or some kind of explosive. But that's, you know what I mean? I don't think Russian commandos went
No,
in there and just.
they didn't pack the grains full of explosives,
Yeah.
and neither is grain that explosive. You know what it actually reminded me of,
Mm.
and we're actually just slightly over 3 years out from that. The explosion in Beirut a few years back. Just
Oh,
the
yes.
way it went up and the way the explosion just looked in general. At first, I thought somebody was reposting footage from the Beirut explosion because I think that was what was it, August 5th, 2020. It was somewhere first week of August 2020 when there was that explosion in Beirut that tanked about a quarter of the economy and that we still really don't have an explanation for. It looked exactly like that, and at least from footage I saw.
Yeah.
And as for what exactly happened, I mean, because I agree with you, yeah, weapons probably were being kept at least around that area or something explosive because it doesn't seem like a sabotage operation to that degree at least. Now maybe somebody sabotaged the explosives that were already there, but in terms of somebody going in planting explosives, etc., that does seem a bit far fetched for me to believe at this moment. As is the question of who, of course, the Russians would be primary suspect when it comes to that, especially with the way the media would spin it as well. But I mean, there's a myriad of different things. But I do think
Hmm.
what this story shows us is that Turkey and the Black Sea, even more so than they already have been since the beginning of this war, are about to become a lot more dangerous places. And keep in mind, especially, well, I mean, we're in August. Turkey has a massive tourism industry. A lot of Europeans use that as their beach destination, so to speak. And when you have ports exploding in major cities, and I can't imagine this is going to be a one-off incident. Like I said, we had that explosion a few weeks ago in Turkey, and especially as relations deteriorate, as the situation does escalate,
Hmm.
the Bosphorus Strait is going to become a very treacherous strait of water. Which, once again, going back to the grain deal, nobody's going to insure shipping freighters that go through that area. Few people are. What's it going to come to? Naval escorts? How is that going to go? How are the Turks going to take that? How is Russia going to take that? How are the Black Sea states going to take that? There's a lot of different factors here, and I do think that the story is too new to really dive too much into that, but it does raise these questions.
Yeah, I mean, someone in one of my chats suggested that this kind of thing does happen especially if safety standards are kind of lax and you have an ongoing heat wave. That is when the grain silo is mostly empty. Somebody lights a cigarette in that area, kaboom. I mean, although
Yeah, the
you know,
Turks
I
smoke like chimneys
thir-
for anyone
thir-
who doesn't know.
that's true. That's true. But 13 of the 16 elevators burned
Yeah,
down.
that's
Is that
excessive.
because one of them? It seems excessive. It seems excessive to me. I can understand one or two silos, but I don't know. Like you say, it's still early.
Yeah, and like I said, I imagine next episode we will have plenty to cover on that, but I will direct our attention, at least for now, before we get into some of the South Africa, which I've been teasing most of the episode, back to Belarus and Poland with some of the tensions with Wagner Group. So it was last week where a helicopter belonging to Belarus, allegedly carrying Wagner forces, did cross into Polish airspace. Now, there was no shooting, there was no incidences, there was no, from either side, no firefights, no skirmishes, whatever you want to call them. But they did violate the airspace, and looks like scary Poland face Article 5 isn't quite the reality it might have seemed, because nothing has come of it yet.
Yeah.
It was, let me get the exact date here. I think it was July 29th, July 30th. Yeah, July 29th, where the Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki accused Wagner fighters of moving to the Suwalki corridor, which is the corridor that lies between Belarus, Lithuania, Kaliningrad, and Poland. And of course, it is vital in order to keep Russia in touch with its exclave. There have been several threats since the beginning of this war in order to cut Russia off from Kaliningrad, at least land access. And it was actually May of 2022. It seemed like that was a real possibility that could have expanded this war into another front. But to nobody's shock, Poland, and particularly Latvia and Lithuania, not as much Estonia, but trust me, they are involved in the mix, are being very. They're acting like the rabid chihuahuas that they are. Let's put it that way. And at this point, as of today, you've had an additional 2,000 troops move to the Polish-Belarusian border, and they plan on deploying an additional 1,000 as well of border guard forces. And they say that there is a wave of migrants trying to pass through. Now, keep in mind that Belarus did have the standoff with Poland, where a lot of migrants were using Belarus as a hub to try to cross into Europe via Poland. And that is still continuing, not to as great as numbers as it was about 2 or 3 years ago, but it still is something that has to be taken into consideration. And many people fearmonger that, of course, Wagner's there. They're going to try to expand the front of the war here. But I still maintain, I've said this last episode, I believe I also said this episode before that. If there's going to be an expansion of this war, at this point, number one, it's going to be from Poland. I think that's not a very unique or
Yeah.
insightful statement. I've been hammering at that for months. But number two, what the direction does appear to be now, what I do think they might be gearing up for, and as I said, I've mentioned this previously, the terrorist designation for Wagner, because that opens up a lot of corridors. Opens up the corridor for both Russia and Belarus to be declared state sponsors of terrorism, for a possible intervention and harsher actions against Belarus being the new
Hmm.
operating base of Wagner, and also opens the door for more intervention into Africa because, and I'll show you some of the maps I have. Russia has military agreements with
There is
most.
actually one other reason.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
There is actually one other reason why they might be tempted to attack Belarus, for which the Wagner excuse is just that, an excuse. And that is this recent attack that I'm talking about that took place over the weekend. The Kinjals that were used for these attacks were launched from Belarus. So if you just look at a map of Ukraine, right, um, Belarus is very close to Western Ukraine where the attacks took place. And that gives the Ukrainians much less time to react and in order to save whatever lives of a command center or planes that are docked there. Remember that they did go after an airport, a military airport, just outside of Khmelnytsky. So that could be another reason that this has given the Russians too much of a strategic advantage, because part of the deal was that Russia would pull away from Kiev for the peace talks, but that also would not launch anything from Belarus. Of course, that is all gone now. We have definitely gone up the escalation ladder, and so yeah, Kinjals fired from Belarus are back on the table.
And Belarus, especially as tensions does increase, if you're going to get the saber rattling from Poland, from the Baltic states, who by extent are supported by the American Empire, you're going to get Russia using Belarus for more operations. They are going to use their personnel and their equipment in Belarus to strike targets in Ukraine, to show really what they're capable of with the forces that they have stationed there. I don't think that the Belarusians are going to get officially involved in the war. I know there's been speculation from day one of the war.
Yeah,
I simply don't see that happen. There's no benefit to be had from any of that, and I, like I said, I also it is they Belarus is also preparing itself for an insurgency of possible Belarusian color revolutionaries who were shipped off to go fight in Ukraine, fight in places like Bakhmut, who are going to go home and protest in Minsk and bring the freedom and democracy revolution courtesy of Poland, the United States, and all the other NATO states. And that's what they're looking at. It's Belarus is becoming far too much of a liability for the Western powers to allow to be this officially neutral operating ground of Russia and of Wagner in particular. Now, Wagner will also be used as an excuse, but I do think that they fear them operating in, let's just say, a much smaller state. Belarus, as I said when Prigozhin was originally exiled, has proven itself to be a very valuable proxy. Despite all the moves towards integration, they still have more than proved themselves as a way to be able to pawn these things off, a way to put them in the background without having it, quote unquote, officially connected to Russia. But
yeah,
at this point, if there is going to be an expansion of the war, which I would say there's a fair chance that is, for all those reasons and more, they're going to go into Belarus. And I know
yeah,
there has been agitation to declare Wagner a terrorist organization for actually years now, even before the outbreak of the war, even as they started to really cut their teeth in Africa and gain infamy there. But how long before we see some resolution before U.S. Congress or the European Parliament to declare it a terrorist organization? Because it opens up so many doors, especially if they want to have any possibility of quote unquote legitimately taking Belarus out of the game, so to speak. It's something that needs to be done because it's an
yeah,
easy label they can slap on it. And even if they don't take out Belarus, and Belarus does manage to weather all of this, it still does tie down Russian resources having to hedge against any potential color revolution or any potential
yes,
action. And once again, that buffer state that is ever so valuable to them.
yeah. I mean, the other the other aspect of this is Uncle Luca has received his Varangian Guard in Wagner.
Yeah,
So
that is the truth. He's pretty much untouchable now. Wait. I think I see the long game here. Hold on. Hold the phone. Prigozhin's going to become president of Belarus.
oh my God.
Prigozhin will succeed Lukashenko.
Yeah.
That's what this is all coming down to. The coup in Moscow
Yeah.
was just a ruse. It's going to happen in Minsk. That's
Yeah.
It- you know what? It's the perfect size state for a warlord. I'll just put it that way. You know, Russia's too big to be ruled by a warlord. It'd break up. Belarus is just fine, especially when you are a proxy of the Russians. It's perfect. It's all coming together. I can't believe I didn't see this before. I feel like such a fool for not having this level of foresight. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. But to get on to some other news, I actually did want to bring up because this was something that came up at the end of last week. I think it was Thursday, Friday, around the time we were recording, and that is some of the stuff that happened with what's his name, Gonzalo Lira. That's his name. Where he put out that video, and I don't want to dwell on this too long, but I do think there are some interesting things to be seen from this. But of course, he was living in Ukraine before the war, internet personality. Look, admittedly, strange guy. I didn't actually know too much about him, but uh, all credit where credit is due. Towards the beginning of the war, especially with what was happening on the ground, exposed a lot of stuff. Gave a lot of great on the ground, first-hand perspective on what was happening. So of course the SBU, the Ukrainian authorities, came down on him like a hammer. And recently he was released from whatever detainment, and he was supposed to go to trial for whatever charges they had him on. And he decided he was going to flee the country and put out like a 45-minute video detailing the situation, in which case he went into a lot of what happens in these Ukrainian prisons. Now, how seriously you want to take him at his word, I have no reason to disbelieve the bulk of what he said, at least the important parts. So, and then apparently he was apprehended at the Hungarian border, if we're to believe the Ukrainian media, and he has not been heard from since. But I use him not to downplay his individual circumstance, because I do think what happened to him is sad, but and what's likely going to happen to him in the near future is also. But if we're to take him at his word, which, like I said, which case I think, at least insofar as this is concerned, that we probably can. The fact that Ukraine has more or less turned to the mass imprisonment and uh, using of forced labor of political dissidents. Now, I don't think this should really shock anyone. The fact that a country, especially this much on the ropes, is going to get forced labor from wherever it can. But once again, I mean, look, we've seen the vans that pick up young men off the street for conscription from, let's just say, the quote unquote undesirable areas of the country, the people who just so happen to be ethnically Russian, ethnically Rusin, Hungarian, Romanian, etc. We've seen what happens to them in this country. And like I said, I don't think it's surprised that, yeah, the Ukrainians are probably running work camps. And I, honestly, the things that would be revealed by a substantial Russian victory at the end of this war. And look, I know the Russians are going to embellish, are going to spin this their own way, because every country does that. But I think it only scratched the surface. Some of the stuff that he was saying of the kind of harrowing things that are actually happening in Ukraine right now, not including the war, but the things that are happening as a result of this war.
Hmm. Can I give you? I mean, I agree with all your points. Like at the end of the day, Ukraine could just have expelled him. Like, there's no reason to hold on to him. There just isn't. However, that said, uh, my take on it is there are several things about him that don't make sense.
Yeah,
And
I think
you
you probably
know,
know more about him than I do, so go on.
yeah. So um, the day that the SMO started on the 24th of February 2022, he was at this, well, for Ukraine, a lavish hotel where even like, dignitaries might stay, right, in central Ukraine. And, he's giving updates on what's happening. And basically, the hotel tells him, because of course, the hotel is being pressured, like, get this guy out of here. Now, I remember he said that his wife and kids were safe. They had gone to Russia. If I'm not mistaken, that they might have gone to Belgorod. Now, did they go there or not? I don't know. Am I not remembering that correctly? But the important point is that they had gone to Russia. So he had about 3, maybe 4 days where he could have done the same thing. Nothing would have impeded him to like follow them. Okay. He didn't know Ukrainian any better than he knows Russian, first of all. Uh, Second of all, he could still have done his reporting from just across the border. Third of all, he could have even re-entered, from the southeastern entrance into Ukraine from Russia, right, and ended up in Lugansk or Donetsk, right, and he would have been very close to the front, but he decided to go against all of that. The other thing is many people had already told him that because he was doing some of his podcasts after he was released. He was initially taken in April 2022 for about 5 days, and then he did some podcasts inside his closet, which was bizarre, right? And people told him, "You're being tracked. Like, just stop doing this." But he persisted, and they, I guess, allowed him to persist. Now, from what I've heard, I'm not going to drop any names, but from what I've heard from other podcasters and stuff, is that when he got out, he reached out to certain people, and those people ignored him because they had been tipped off that he is now, whether he likes it or not, an SBU asset. And there's something bizarre, I think, that he would do a video just before he crossed the border. He said he was 5 kilometers away from the border, and he does these 3 videos, each one roughly 14 to 15 minutes long, explaining his situation. And I just find that bizarre. Like, why would you do that,
Yeah, it was.
right?
I mean,
He's being tracked.
I bring up the situation because a lot of it was very strange, and also one thing that, not to pick this apart too much, that I thought was strange. Now, he did preempt in the video why he decided to go to Hungary instead of Russia because, of course, with how fortified and militarized the border is, which makes sense. But I'm left wondering, why not go towards Belarus then? Why why go? I mean, look,
Yeah,
I know Hungary is a bit of a renegade, but still in the European Union. European Union pressure could very easily, if his plan would have worked, could very easily turn into him being sacrificed for the sake of Hungary not having their assets frozen or something along those lines. When Belarus was right to the north, and I know that I'm trying to remember where I heard this from, but I think it might have been actually like a Russian guy I know, that a lot of Ukrainian political dissidents went to Belarus as well, like sought asylum
yeah.
there in particular. So I figured that would have been the most logical destination for
Now
something
you
like
could
that.
say that that area is mined, trenches have been created. Remember when the Ukrainians thought that the Russians would pour in over the Belarus
Oh
border
yeah,
because there
yeah,
were hundreds of thousands of troops being trained there? Okay, let's say that's a dissuasive element for him to choose Belarus as a destination. But he said something else that was kind of odd, right? He said that he was released, he was given back his passport. He claims that there was extortion involved, and so on. But he was given his passport. He was, his phone, everything. His old coach Red, one of his channels is still under their control, and he can't get it back. But the other 2 channels that he created, I believe Roundtable is one of the other 2. He still has control of them. Of course, he has control over his Twitter account and so on. But then information started to pop up based on what some other people on the net had said, and we're talking about fairly influential people. I don't know what people think of Scott Ritter. You know he's whatever. I don't follow Scott Ritter all that much, to be quite honest, and haven't for a while. I know they had some kind of a falling out. but he's not the only one who's saying this. The Canadian journalist, I believe her name is Eva Garrett. Um, she has it on authority that he was actually released, I believe, July 9th. So he was released much earlier than he claimed because he said they released him 2 days before his court case. Now, why would they release him before his court case? Right? Well, he gives an explanation. He says, because they basically wanted him gone. They extorted the money, and now they just wanted to get rid of him. And if he could make it out, I guess it's like the Hunger Games or something. If he could make it out of Ukraine, he would have everything he needed, right, to um, claim asylum. And uh, so he was actually let out earlier, and so he's basically saying, well, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. There was an agreement between me and the SBU to like let me out, right? That's what he's saying. That's
Yeah.
what. Now you take a guy like Navalny. Navalny, he had his day in court in the prison, right? Like there's things about this that don't make sense, and of course, people who he spoke with, people who donate money to him, they're all on the list, because they follow him, right? And the whole thing, I think, was like some kind of intelligence project on the part of the SBU.
Yeah, I mean,
And
given everything that you've laid out, I'm not going to necessarily co-sign that, but it's not unreasonable.
yeah, it's not unreasonable. I don't claim to know what the answer is, but like I say, there are a lot of things about his story that don't make sense to me. Like, is he so crazy that he would like he could have left with his family? Like, he thought like the war would end quickly and he would be there when like that's I mean, even if a war ends quickly, right? Near the end, like World War II had more casualties in the last year for that 5 month period than it did in the previous. Like a lot of people die extra when a war is nearing its end, right? Because people
Oh
get
yeah,
very desperate, right? And there's a
that's
lot
usually what
of
ends the war.
yes, and there's a lot of like revenge for the you know negative outcome. Um, so like I don't know, is he so stupid that he wouldn't have thought of that? Like if
I
you're losing, they don't say like, you know what, Gonzalo, you were right. Like we did lose this war. I guess I won't kill you now. Like no, these people would be enraged.
Oh, absolutely. We've seen this happen time and time again. Not just in this war, but wars throughout history. But once again, the conclusion I initially came to before you brought up the SBU angle, which I think makes a lot of sense, was that this is either a man who is very confident, perhaps overconfident himself, or has a death wish, or maybe a little bit of both.
Mm, mm, mm.
And I don't know. I guess that depending on what type of person you are, there is a certain thrill of thinking like, oh, I get to be in the center of this moment of world history, and I get to report on it firsthand, something like that, or I get to witness it with my eyes. I mean, I could see that, and it's not me personally, but there's people like that. But yeah, there was a lot strange about the situation, and like I said, I didn't want to dwell on it too long. But
Yeah.
I do think that it exposes, even beyond just him as an individual, what the Ukrainian state has frankly devolved into at this point. Even if you are going to, and I'm not talking about you just in general, even if you are going to raise an eyebrow at this guy, which I think is completely fair. But I think if you can divorce the words from who said them, and like I said, I think you brought up a lot of interesting points that hopefully we get more information on at some point. Uh, there's a there's a lot you could dig into, and I think that especially years after this war is over, especially if in the event of Russian victory, and however the Russian media and journalists or whatever decide to whatever position they decide to take on this, we're probably going to learn a lot of very damning things about the forefront of freedom and democracy.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. So I mean, I guess we'll wait and see. But I like you know, at first I didn't know. I didn't know really what to think. Um, but the moment I witnessed those videos, I just thought, like, why are you doing this now? Like, why? Like, this is so stupid. Like, worry about getting across the border first, right? And you said you gave them something like between 70 to $90,000, right? Like you would find a way to bribe the guards.
I mean, just to put it in perspective, I don't know if I covered this, but on, in Odessa, there was actually a smuggling operation that got men of fighting age into Moldova, and that guy got something like 1,000 people out before being busted. And if look, your average young man in Odessa can afford that, even if he does have to pay every penny of his life savings into it. I mean, understandably so. Then I think somebody with his means shouldn't have had any problems getting out of the country.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that guy in Odessa, that Moldovan guy who would ferry them back and from Odessa. He did that on horseback, which I personally think is amazing. But that's an entirely different topic in and of itself. But something you know what? Actually, screw it. We'll get right into Niger. We've been waiting too long for that. So, as of yesterday, the week-long ultimatum expired for Niger, where the economic cooperation of West African states, ECOWAS, said that the military regime in Niger had 1 week to step down. That expired yesterday. Now, half of these countries, which also underwent their own military coups, Burkina Faso is the main one that comes to mind, as said that they were going to stand by the government in Niger. Now, to give a little bit of background for the situation, Niger, of course, is a former French colony, and for years, even after the French officially withdrew, they've kept forces there. They've had economic investments there. They've tried to place a lot of their former colonies under a monetary union. I think it was the West African franc or something like that, or maybe that was the Central African franc with their other colony. But point being is they've tried to place these post-colonial states under their economic and monetary unions whenever they can. Understandable so, pragmatic reasons. Keep in mind that, at least according to 2020 data, Niger was actually the largest exporter of uranium to the European Union, and that, of course, in second place was Russia. So we're we're talking about an energy crisis as it is. We're talking about the European Parliament for months now have been trying to sanction Russian nuclear fuel. We're talking about one of their biggest sources of uranium goes offline because of a coup. And of course, with this, the new regime is far more amenable to Russia, far more willing to cooperate with Russia. There is a Wagner presence in the country that more or less took over the role of the French Foreign Legion. I believe it was in Mali, which is another former French colony. We saw almost a play by play of this situation in 2020, where you had a president from a minority group. President Bazoum was an Arab before and he was overthrown. And I think Arabs are single digit percent population of Niger. So, of course, ethnic tensions are going to play a role into that. There's other ethnic tensions with the groups that want to secede, the Tuaregs, which are a desert tribe, and of course, a lot of the territory they have is sitting on precious natural resources like uranium. Once again, this is just a story that happens time and time again with a lot of these African states. But beyond Niger, I think just the political situation in Africa in general, has taken a drastic turn just in the past 3 years. Because I just want to show you a graphic that I have. So this right here is going to be a map of Africa, And all the countries that are highlighted in red are countries that have some sort of military agreement with Russia. It's most of the continent at this point, with and all the major players on the continent, barring South Africa. Now I know South Africa is on a sharp decline, but once again they still have quite a bit of economic and not sure what the military situation in South Africa is, but they have quite a bit of economic power and quite a few natural resources that they are sitting on, regardless of political state in the country. But look, they have Egypt, they have Algeria. Algeria is probably the country in Africa that has been punching far above its weight at this point, especially with recent events. And it's dominated in whatever areas that the Russians don't dominate. It's mostly the French occupying. Like you see that swath of countries in Central Africa, including Democratic Republic of the Congo, Central African Republic, etc., etc. These are the countries where the French still do have a foothold. Now, as for this other part of the West African coastline, I can't speak too much to that. But once again, this just gives you an idea of the amount of political influence that Russia has in Africa. And recently, the Russians started a program of debt forgiveness for several African nations, and they also sent grain shipments. So they're buying quite a bit of favor on the continent as is. And I know the Chinese have been investing in Africa for about the past, 20 years at this point. Uh, I, this is a side note. Everyone should watch Empire of Dust. It's a very eye opening documentary on just the state of post colonial Africa and some of the Chinese projects going on there. Like I know there's quite a few memes from it, but it actually is quite an interesting watch. But that's aside the point. But you have one of the most resource rich one of the most resource rich continents in the world falling right into both Russian and Chinese hands. The Europeans have, and by extent the Americans, the Western world, has spurned any goodwill it had there. It has failed to capitalize on the myriad of opportunities that they've had there. I just look at the American approach to Africa from the 1970s, 1980s onwards, where it's these humanitarian missions. It's these spreading liberalism and democracy to Africa. We're going to, rather than trying to extract the oil, the gold, the uranium, make actual lucrative economic deals for not only yourself, but frankly both parties involved in that point. We're going to give the Africans birth control and vaccines for whatever reason in Kenya or whatever. But point being is the quote unquote humanitarian approach is very surface level. Look at how morally upright and righteous we are for helping the poor third world countries while not really seeing any benefit from it. Whereas you have, once again, Russia and China come in, love them, hate them. They make lucrative deals with these countries. Now, you may say they're one side deals, whatever. Yeah, sure. Russia and China are probably getting a lot more out of these deals than the African countries. But once again, this is the most significant economic development we have seen in Africa since the end of the European empires. And I think that's really just indisputable. And it really is, we've discussed previously on the show. I'll reiterate for a third time, I don't care whether you love or hate Russia and China. Bringing some degree of economic and political stability to Africa is in everyone's interest because we're talking one of the most populated continents in the world with millions, if not tens of millions of people who would leave in a heartbeat if they could, in a population that is only growing. Now, the growth isn't as sharp as it was, say, a few decades ago, but it is a rapidly growing population in Africa. So we're put in the position where the continent can either be stabilized and people can benefit from that on both sides, or we can talk about yet another endless wave of migrant crises. Now, I don't know which option sounds more preferable to you, but I know which one sounds more preferable to me. I'm getting a little bit lost in the weeds here when it comes to the whole Niger situation. So, you have the coup that happened. So far, there has not been any response, even though the deadline has expired. And
Mm-hmm.
what is really concerning here, which is why I think something's probably going to inflame here, is I just have a map of current pipeline networks that run from Africa to Europe right now. So you have that map on screen. It shows the ones that are operational, under construction, being planned out, offline, etc., etc. But you see this network that runs through the heart of West Africa. You have Nigeria, Niger, Algeria, Morocco, Libya, etc., running straight into Europe. And mind you, insofar as Russian energy is unavailable or heavily restricted in Europe, this is really right here, this map you're looking at, the only alternative that they have. So, as Europe casts its lot in with Ukraine, casts its lot in with the American Empire, and look, I'll cut the Europeans some slack. It's not exactly like they have too much sovereignty left to go around these days. But point being is, you look at, I'll pull up that Russian influence in Africa map again. You look at the amount of Russian influence in Africa, the Europeans are on a path to be virtually cut off from their two major energy suppliers, because of course the Russians, that ship has sailed. But as these countries, as these regimes come to power in Africa that are far more anti-European and far more willing to cooperate with Russia and China, Europe continues once again on that downward spiral. And the hell of a thing they'll try to tell you while all of this is that, to quote the words of the beloved Italian Prime Minister, who recently conceded that, of course, our economy needs more migrants to support the pension systems. That's the curse of right wing politics anywhere in the Western European, whatever you want to call it, world. It happens time and time again. But you know, it's Wagner that's destabilizing Africa. It's Wagner that's shipping over all the migrants. We bear no responsibility for that, of course. But it has become a situation where it's really a do or die moment for the French for any sort of influence and respect that they have, because they have invested so much into West Africa in particular, Africa as a whole, but West Africa in particular, trying to be this, trying to really recapture the glory days of their empire. And especially with the Jupiterian President Macron, who wants to have this legacy, who wants to have a strategically autonomous Europe. This is, once again, France's greatest geopolitical project in the past 30 years is slipping right through his fingers. And it's going to, as I said, be a do or die moment for the French. At this point, the French cannot afford not to act. What else are they going to do to maintain both credibility on just a rhetorical level, on a narrative level, and honestly be able to stay competitive from a raw self-interest, raw resource levels? There's really no other option that they have, and like I was saying before, these ECOWAS states, about half of them at least, they are positioning troops along the border in Niger, along the border with Niger, not Nigeria, Niger, where it, in my opinion, this is probably going to be a not necessarily a massive conflict, but we're looking at yet another low-level conflict that's breaking out in Africa. Now, what will come of that? I think there's a lot of potential for a global incident to come of this, because I was joking with you the other day that we're going to see Wagner and the French Foreign Legion start to face off in Africa. But once again, as these interests do come to a head, as especially you have France and by extension the Europeans really can't afford to lose influence over this part of Africa, it opens up yet the potential for more confrontation, more escalation, just on a global scale. Now, so far, which I think it is a bit funny, just given perhaps they don't want Biden to have a teleprompter mishap with a name as sensitive as this. But the Americans have been more or less quiet on this. Now, I know Newland was allegedly supposed to be going to, I think, she was supposed to be going to one of the neighboring countries and supporting the effort to quote unquote bring democracy back to Niger. But yeah, and I mean, look, we have Victoria Nuland, the harbinger of war and death, coming to
Mhm.
the African continent. I guess Ukraine wasn't good enough.
She is right there, eh?
Yeah, she is. But like I said, I think that we have a very it's a very new situation, so there's only so much you can say without speculating. But I think we have a very concerning situation at hand, regardless of whatever way you slice this, because everyone's going to find a reason to get involved, and a lot of them, frankly, have good reason to get involved. And this is going to be, once again, yet another blow to Europe as well, especially when it comes to the energy market. And once again, I want you to focus on this map that I have up right here. And hell, wouldn't it be something for the Americans if the African energy network to Europe just collapsed and they were required to buy even more outrageously priced American LNG?
Mhm. Um, uh, uh, I mean, the U.S. and France, of course, have like about 1,000 men in Niger, and as I understand it, the Ukrainians have 3 bases. So, I mean, I'm honestly surprised nothing has happened so far. And as far as I understand, the country south of Niger, uh, their parliament has voted against intervening. It could have been their Senate, if I'm not mistaken. So, hmm, it, I would guess that it's not really a united front right now at the moment. Um, of course, Nigeria has a huge population. It's like 10 times the size of Niger, something like 25 million versus 25 million.
Yes, and Nigeria is also a country that's had its own myriad of ethnic and tribal conflict that has been plaguing it for the past several years as well. But getting back to the point of the American presence there, actually, as a result of this coup, the Americans have a massive drone base there that they can't functionally operate because they can't get it off the ground. They've been cut off by any local authorities or infrastructures, and it just 110. I think they said it was 110 billion, no, 110 million, excuse me, base just sitting there completely furloughed because there's nothing they can do with it, and this is supposed to be our center of command for whatever interest that we might have in West Africa. And you recall, I think it was 2019, 2020, there was actually American forces that were killed by some insurgent group in Niger.
Mm.
And I remember the jokes going around that, oh no, don't give Trump the teleprompter. He's going to say it. He's going to finally drop it. But the, it really is the situation where, yeah, we're locked in there as well as everywhere else, and it's yet another front the American empire has to manage. And to be frank, when you have Ukraine, when you have Taiwan, when you have Iran, how much is the American empire going to really be able to invest into any sort of adventure into West Africa?
Yeah. Um, yeah, I mean, uh, did you think something would happen by now?
Um, I'll just put it this way: I wouldn't have ruled it out, but it doesn't surprise me that everyone is just standing back and standing by, waiting for the right moment. It's a classic powder
Because
keg.
yeah, because sanctions have been placed, and France and the U.S. have cut off. France has cut off aid to Burkina Faso. So maybe they're going through like a speed run escalation, um, in Niger the way they did with Ukraine. So could take a few months, but
And then you also have the behemoth that is Algeria sitting there. And as so far as both African and Arab military power is concerned, the Algerians are actually pretty competent, especially compared to the rest of their neighbors. And they're also a pretty wealthy country compared to the rest of their neighbors, and a pretty functional country, once again, compared to the rest of their neighbors. So, and the Algerians have been signing agreements with the Russians. They've been trying to join BRICS. That's the direction that they have been taking their country. Just when it
mhm.
comes to the way that the world is breaking up on certain, let's just say, geopolitical lines. And with that being said, I think it's pretty clear who they would support in any potential conflict in Niger. So, like I said, it's a classic powder keg. It's just somebody. Everyone is waiting for somebody else to fire the first shot. The question is who's really going to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Ultimately, the pressure is on Nigeria and the West because, I mean, you know, the president has been removed. Um, how are they going to get him back? Right. The onus is on them to reinstall him, and
Is this going to be the
obviously,
next Guido Tinovskaya figure who just goes around
yeah,
and gives speeches and book tours?
it is looking that way.
And once again, I know virtually nothing about the background of this guy. I can only assume that with how much support's being thrown behind him, he probably is a product of the system. I think you all know which one I'm talking about. And they're going to do anything they can to get a guy like that back in power. And the question is, I think the question once again really comes down to, with all the other theaters, how much is the American empire really willing to invest in a potential conflict or unrest in West Africa? I cannot see it being anywhere near the top of its priorities. In which case, I think that makes it number one, passes the burden onto the already beleaguered France, as most European states are pretty beleaguered at this point economically, and Russia, and at least in this context, a lesser extent China. China's most of its activity is in East Africa, so not that they don't have interest in West Africa, but point being is, and when it comes to who really has more position to expend resource and manpower in Africa, in Niger, it's going to be the Russians, especially via Wagner. And Wagner, once again, has proven to be an indispensable asset in
Mm.
all of this. And this is only a few months after there was that incident in Sudan as well. Now, not much ever really ended up coming of that, but these countries are slowly. I mean, not that they were the paragons of political stability, but the current order in those countries is slowly being swept away. And some people speculate that neighboring Chad is going to be the next country to have a Wagner presence in it. Now, I think that's more or less a foregone conclusion because looking at it from the perspective of these African countries, these Wagner troops have proven that yeah, they can fight. Yeah, they are willing to engage these insurgents on grounds that will actually be able to suppress them, and that they can actually provide at least a degree of security to the important people and the important resources. So, especially compared to the last 2 or 3 decades of Western military blunders, it's a no-brainer, and it's a very easy choice and probably a much more cost-effective choice, all things considered.
Yeah, I mean, we should mention that both Russia and Algeria have condemned the coup, right? And I suppose this gives Russia like plausible deniability. Now, there's nothing confirmed so far to indicate that Wagner is in Niger at the moment, right? We don't know. Um, there was that rumor, I believe, on Friday or Saturday that was saying that their plane landed, but nobody had nobody had any footage of it, right? And yeah, so I don't know. Um, I mean, I'm very sure that Russia would like to get Niger completely on its side, and of course, there are a lot of people, who are because the thing is right, like Russia didn't train these guys. Like all the guys in the military were trained by the French and the Americans, right? So if Russia's doing this, it's pretty sophisticated. Um, it's obviously like some kind of like major subversion. I don't know. It's just something. It's just something to consider. I think I hate to say that it's early, but maybe it is early still um, to say one thing or another definitively.
I mean, I would agree that the situation is far too new to really make any definitive statements about this, but I think it's a harbinger of things to come. Very vague answer, very competent answer, I feel like, but it's really the best I can say.
Yeah. Yeah, same here. I don't know.
But did you have any last minute topics that we might have missed?
Um, I only that ISIS is attacking more in Saudi Arabia. Sorry, in Syria. I'm sorry. Um, there was an attack by Israel in Syria, but I saw video footage, and a lot of the missiles were intercepted. No great damage. Perfectly blunt about it. So yeah. Off the top of my head, I don't really have anything.
I know there was the quote unquote peace summit in Saudi Arabia, but I think that I'm gonna give that another week or so to settle before I just give a final after action report because it seemed pretty uneventful, which is why I was even hesitant to bring it up right now. But just to just to put that out there, that yeah, there'll probably be at least some brief coverage of that in a following episode. But yeah, that's all I had. So thank you everyone for tuning in to another episode of the War Report. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.